In this lesson, we're going to learn how to come in and name all of our layers and finish setting up our render. So I've just opened up 12 underscore end and we have all of our layers set up. So now let's jump in and start bumping up the quality and setting up our render. So let's begin in the render settings and let's change our image format to something that is a little bit nicer, something that is a little bit more, I should say, other application friendly. So something like a Targa or a TIFF sequence will work for almost any application. If you're rendering out to something like Nuke or to composite in Nuke, you can use OpenEXR, although in this case we're going to use Targa. So of course, to render out an animation, we're going to need to do a lot of changes. Need to set our extension to name.number.extension. And let's jump down here and change our end frame to 40. We want to change, of course, our renderable camera to camera 1, which is the animated camera we got from our Match Moving software. And if we were doing a production render, we would change our presets from our custom back to our HD 1080. However, for this course, I'm just going to keep it at this half 1080 resolution because it's a little bit easier to see and it fits on my screen. But if you want to do full quality, you can definitely change your preset back to full 1080. Of course, this will impact your render time as you are rendering out an HD signal, which is a lot of data to process. So now that we have these all set up, we're going to have to come back here to our file name once we start dealing with our layers. But let's just jump through here and check that we have everything set correctly. So let's go to our features. Okay, final gather's on. Now in our quality, we want to bump up our adaptive sampling from -1 to 1 to at least 0 and 2, if not more, because that will let us gain a lot of samples per pixel, which really helps out with the jagged edges in our scene. So let's check our indirect light. We have final gathering on. Okay, so it looks like we have everything set up correctly inside of our render settings except for our file name prefix. As you see here, it's going to create a new folder called ColorPass inside of our Maya project. So to begin, let's type in images, or you can type in renders to place this inside of a images folder. Now, it's still going to create this before our images, or before our image folder. So what I want to do is I want to actually place this inside of my file name. So for an easy way to do this, we can right click and go to Insert Layer Name, or type in the carets and the render layer. And now you can see that the color pass is actually in the name. Now we want to make sure to label these. So let's call this street sign underscore render layer, just so we don't have 1,000 different images called color pass that are from different Maya projects. And now we can take a look at this render pass. Now, this is only an issue for our color pass layer, and actually it's only an issue for our color pass layer because it's the only layer that has multiple passes assigned to it. So what Maya wants to do is it wants to take each of these render passes and create a new folder for it, and then create a new folder called images, and then create the street sign color pass. So what we would end up with are 3 different image sequences called this exact name except in different folders. So obviously we don't want that. However, let's take a look at what the other layers would look like. So let's go to our AO sign. Now we can see that this is looking correct. It's going to create inside of our images folder a street sign underscore AO sign from 1 to 40. So that looks fine. And as we can see, this is the correct file name prefix for all the rest of these layers, even our motion vector layer. It's going to create it with the correct naming and in the folder we want. So for our color pass, we can simply add on an override, that handy dandy create layer override. And now we can add another underscore here, and again right click, and this time let's choose render pass. And now each of those render passes will be added into our file name. So we'll get images that say street underscore sign underscore color pass underscore and then diffuse indirect specular. Okay, so we have all of our render settings correctly set. Let's just double check the camera, image size, okay. Correct extension, file name prefixes set correctly. All right, everything's looking good. So now let's jump over to one of our shadow layers, let's say shadow ground, and render this out. Because right now our light is set on a very low quality standard. So what we're going to get is a very sharp shadow. When in the real world, shadows sort of spread out the further away they get from a light, or from the object that is casting the shadow, I should say. So right now, our light is not doing this. So to bump up its quality a little bit, let's jump over to the light, directional light shape. In shadows, we can scroll down to use ray trace, and now we can do two things. We can increase our light angle, which increases essentially the area that the shadow is being cast from. You can think of it as shooting a laser at this will give you the super straight shadows, but if you use something like a spotlight that actually has a pretty big light bulb in it, you're going to get nice soft shadows. Now, of course, it's really easy to bump up this too far, so let's try 1 and then take a look. Now, as you increase your light angle, you're not really going to see too much of a change. Well, we're going to see a change, but it's not going to be very high quality until we bump up our shadow rays. So let me just re-render this small section right here. And you can see that we're getting some separation, but it's really, really jagged. So what we need to do to make that higher quality is bump up these shadow rays. So let's bump them up to something like 32, which is pretty high, but since we're only rendering out a few shadows, and shadows are very important to getting the realism down, it's important that we have high quality shadows. So I just hit render again, and as you can see, it's taking a little longer to render, but the actual shadow quality that comes out is much nicer. You can see we've got a really great fall off here at the edge, and we've got really nice tight shadows here at where it's close to the object. Okay. Now there's one last issue I want to address, and that is currently we do not have any diffuse light being emitted in our scene. We're solely relying on the indirect light to light our scene. So let's actually jump back to our color pass here. Let's take a look at what would happen if we turn back on our emit diffuse. Now obviously this is going to add a ton of light into our scene, but now we have the ability with our diffuse lighting on to separate the diffuse with the indirect, so we can dial this in inside of our compositing application. Still, this is a little bit too bright, so we can always rebalance this out by lowering this primary diffuse scale. So let's lower this down to, let's say 2, and that should give us a nice mix of diffuse lighting and our indirect lighting. So let me just re-render this region, and then we can move on. Okay, so this is a little bit more balanced. Let's actually double check one more thing. So we're inside of our color pass. Now we do not actually want to be emitting any shadows at this time because this is going to slow down our render. We want to only emit shadows in our shadow layers. So let's go down here, create a layer override, and then turn off use ray trace shadows. And now we shouldn't have any shadowing in our scene. Alright, so now that we have everything set up and all of our quality settings at the correct setting, we can just go to render and batch render. Now, of course, depending on your system, this render might take from, I'd say, about 30 minutes to possibly a few hours. On the machine I'm using, it takes about 40 minutes to render this out, so at about a minute a frame. And we have to remember that we are rendering out quite a few different layers and passes. So Maya is doing quite a bit of work to give us all of the data we need to composite. So if we look at our Maya project now, should be able to see inside our images folder that our images are starting to get shot out. So let me jump down to where they're appearing. And so I rendered this earlier, and it came out to be about 700 megs, so we're going to have to figure out something a little bit different, because obviously I'd really like to give you these image files, but 735 megs is even a little bit too much for me. So I'll get those down to a little bit smaller format and then package them inside the project file so you don't have to wait around for this to finish rendering out. So our first batch just got finished, so as always, whenever we're doing rendering, we want to double check that all of our images are coming out and looking good. So here's our diffuse contribution, the indirect contribution. Okay, they look a little similar, but you can see a very noticeable bluish tint on that, so we can always dial that in. Here's our master beauty. that came out, and this one actually has our alpha layer. Let me turn off my RGB. And here's our alpha, and then finally we have the specular. So Mental Ray is going to run through and just try and render all of this out, and then we can come back and begin compositing this in the next lesson.